The pool party. In 1985, 31-year-old Jerome Moody went to a pool party the city of New Orleans had thrown for its lifeguards. They were celebrating an entire season without a single drowning. Over 200 people showed up. More than 100 of them were certified lifeguards, and 4 were stationed on active duty at the pool that night. There was food, drinks, and swimming. At the end of the night, guests started heading home. As people cleared out, someone noticed a body sitting at the bottom of the deep end. It was Jerome. He had been down there for hours while the party was still going on, and nobody noticed. Jerome wasn't a lifeguard. He was just a guest. The season without a drowning ended at the party they threw to celebrate it. The fish delivery. In 1671, François Fatel was hired to organize a 3-day feast for King Louis XIV of France. He was a maître d'hôtel, basically the head of everything: food, service, and entertainment. Around 3,000 guests were expected. Fatel hadn't slept in 12 nights preparing for it. Then, things started going wrong. More guests showed up than planned, and 2 tables ran short on roast. That night, fog rolled in and ruined the fireworks. The next morning was a Friday. In Catholic France, that meant fish had to be served. Fatel woke up at 4 to check on the delivery. Only 2 small shipments had arrived. He asked the supplier if that was all. The supplier said yes, not realizing Fatel was asking about all the suppliers, not just him. As far as Fatel knew, the feast was ruined, and his reputation along with it. So he went back to his room and stabbed himself with his sword. Minutes later, fish deliveries started arriving from every port in the region. There was more than enough for everyone. The party went on without him. The scarf. On September 14, 1927, 50-year-old Isadora Duncan was getting ready for an evening drive in Nice, France. Duncan was an American dancer known for performing barefoot in flowing robes and long silk scarves. The scarves became her signature. She wore them on stage and off. The car belonged to Benoit Falchetto, a French-Italian mechanic. It was an Amilcar CGSS, a small open-top sports car with open-spoked wheels. A friend told Duncan to wear a cape because of the cold. She refused and threw a long, hand-painted silk scarf over her shoulder instead. Then she got into the passenger seat. The end of the scarf hung down low over the side of the car. When Falchetto pulled away, the trailing end got caught in the open spokes of the rear wheel. The scarf wrapped tight around the wheel and axle and yanked Duncan out of the car by her neck. The force snapped her spine, crushed her throat, and dragged her along the stone road. Falchetto hit the brakes within seconds, but she was already dead. Doctors later said she was nearly decapitated. The orange peel. On July 25, 1911, a man named Bobby Leach climbed into a steel barrel and went over Niagara Falls. The drop is 167 feet. He became only the 2nd person in history to survive it. The fall broke both his kneecaps, fractured his jaw, and left him in the hospital for 6 months. After he recovered, Leach spent the next 15 years touring the world with his barrel, telling the story. In his 60s, he went back to the falls and tried to swim the Whirlpool Rapids. He failed and had to be rescued. In 1926, while on a publicity tour in New Zealand, Leach was walking down Princes Street in Auckland when he slipped on an orange peel and broke his leg. The wound got infected. Gangrene set in and doctors had to amputate. Bobby Leach died 2 months later. The tortoise. A Greek playwright named Aeschylus was once told by a prophecy that he would be killed by a falling object. He took it seriously. He started spending as much time outdoors as he could, away from buildings, rooftops, and anything that could collapse on him. Around 455 BC, the 67-year-old Aeschylus was walking through an open field in the countryside of Sicily. An eagle was flying overhead carrying a tortoise. Eagles eat tortoises by dropping them from high up onto smooth rocks to crack the shell open. The eagle let go, and the tortoise landed on Aeschylus's bald head and killed him. He is still known today as the father of tragedy. The chestnut tree. In March 1938, a playwright named Odin von Horvath fled Vienna after the Nazis took over Austria and banned his work. He went to Budapest first, then made his way to Paris. Horvath had always been afraid of storms. A few days before his death, he told a friend he wasn't so afraid of the Nazis. There were worse things to be scared of, he said. Things you fear without knowing why. On June 1, 1938, less than 3 months after arriving in Paris, the 36-year-old Horvath was walking down the Champs-Élysées when a thunderstorm rolled in. He stepped under a large chestnut tree to wait it out. Lightning struck the tree, and a heavy branch came down on his head and killed him. He died directly across the street from the Théâtre Marigny. The alarm clock. In the 1880s, a lamplighter named Samuel Wardell had a problem. His job required him to be up before dawn every morning to put out the street lamps in Flatbush, New York. But Wardell was an exceptionally heavy sleeper, and a regular alarm clock wasn't enough to wake him, so he built his own. He connected a wire from his alarm clock to a shelf above his bed and placed a 10-pound rock on it. When the alarm went off, the shelf would tip and the rock would crash onto the floor next to his bed. The noise was loud enough to wake him every time. It worked perfectly for months. On Christmas Eve 1885, Wardell hosted a party and moved the furniture around to make room for guests. After the party, he went to bed without noticing that his bed was now directly under the shelf. The alarm went off at 5 in the morning. The rock didn't hit the floor. It hit Wardell. He died a few days later on New Year's Eve. The jockey. On June 4, 1923, a stable hand named Frank Hayes finally got his chance to ride in a real race. Hayes had spent years training horses at Belmont Park in New York, but what he really wanted was to be a jockey. His boss agreed to let him ride a mare named Sweet Kiss. There was one problem. Hayes was too heavy. He had to lose over 10 pounds in a single day just to be allowed to ride. He jogged for hours, barely ate, and stopped drinking water. By the time he climbed onto the horse, he was light enough, but he was weak. Sweet Kiss was a 20-to-1 long shot. Nobody expected her to win, but she took the lead on the final stretch and crossed the finish line first. When the owner came to congratulate Hayes, he was slumped forward in the saddle. A doctor looked him over and said he was dead. He had suffered a heart attack somewhere during the race, and his body had stayed on the horse the whole time. It was his first and only race. The horse was nicknamed Sweet Kiss of Death and never raced again. The Poodle. On October 21, 1988, a poodle named Kachi fell from a 13th floor balcony in Buenos Aires and landed on a 75-year-old woman named Marta Espina, who was walking on the sidewalk below. Both died on impact. A crowd gathered to see what had happened. A 46-year-old woman named Edith Sola stepped off the curb to get a closer look and was hit by a bus, killing her instantly. Moments later, a man walking out of a nearby pharmacy who had seen both of these things happen went into cardiac arrest and died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. The dog had been chasing a tennis ball. The wrong turn. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the next in line to rule the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was riding through Sarajevo in an open car with his wife Sophie. 6 Serbian nationalists were waiting along the route to kill him. The first one threw a bomb. It bounced off the car and went off under the one behind them. The cars sped away and the other 5, including a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, never got the chance to act. The plan had failed, and the group scattered. Ferdinand went ahead with his visit to City Hall. When the mayor started his welcome speech, Ferdinand cut him off and said, "I came here on a visit, and I am greeted with bombs." But he stayed. Afterward, he wanted to go to the hospital to check on an officer who had been hurt by the bomb. His driver, who didn't know the city well, turned down the wrong street and stopped the car to turn around. He had stopped right in front of where Princip was standing. Princip pulled out a pistol and shot Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. Both of them died within the hour. 5 weeks later, World War I began. The cow. In 2013, a 45-year-old man named João Maria de Souza was asleep in bed with his wife in Caratinga, Brazil. Their house was small and sat at the bottom of a steep hill where local cattle roamed. That night, a 1-ton cow wandered off a nearby farm, walked up the hill, and stepped onto the roof. The roof gave way, and the cow fell 8 feet onto de Souza's side of the bed. His wife wasn't hurt. Neither was the cow. De Souza was taken to the hospital with a broken leg and died the next day from internal bleeding. It was the 3rd time a cow had fallen through a roof in that area. The tram. On June 7, 1926, a 73-year-old man was hit by a tram while crossing the street in Barcelona. He was knocked to the ground and lost consciousness. People nearby looked at him and assumed he was a beggar. His clothes were worn out, his hair was a mess, and he had no wallet or identification on him. 2 men tried to get him a taxi to the hospital, but 3 drivers refused to take him when they saw what he looked like. A 4th didn't even stop. A police officer finally forced a 5th taxi to pick him up. He was taken to a charity hospital for the poor and given basic care. It wasn't until the next day that a chaplain from a nearby church recognized him. The man was Antoni Gaudí, the most famous architect in Barcelona and the designer of the Sagrada Familia. By then, it was too late. Gaudí died 3 days after the accident. Thousands of people lined the streets for his funeral. The taxi drivers who refused to take him were found and fined. The funeral. In 2011, a 49-year-old woman named Fagiliu Mukametsianov collapsed at her home in Kazan, Russia, with chest pains. Doctors at the hospital said she had suffered a heart attack and declared her dead. 2 days later, her family held a funeral. As mourners prayed around her open coffin, Mukametsianov opened her eyes. She saw where she was and started screaming. The shock gave her a real heart attack. Her husband rushed her back to the hospital, but she died 12 minutes later. He later said they could have saved her. The cigarette. On May 22, 1867, 18-year-old Archduchess Matilda of Austria was getting ready for a night at the theater in Vienna. She put on a long gauze dress and, while waiting to leave, lit a cigarette. Her father had strictly forbidden her from smoking, so when she heard him coming, she hid it behind her back. The lit end touched the gauze. The dress caught fire instantly and burned her back, arms, neck, and legs before anyone could put it out. Matilda died 16 days later from the burns. She had been set to marry the Crown Prince of Italy. The escape? On July 28, 1980, 32-year-old Troy Leon Gregg was sitting on death row at Georgia State Prison for a double murder. He was 2 days away from being put to death. That night, he and 3 other inmates sawed through the bars of their cells and through a window, climbed along the outside ledge to a fire escape, and made it down to the ground. They had changed their prison clothes to look like guard uniforms, so when real guards stopped them on the way out, they told them they were doing security checks. The guards believed them and let them through. There was a car waiting in the parking lot, and they drove off. Hours later, Gregg walked into a bar in North Carolina and got into a fight. He was beaten to death. His body was found the next morning floating in a river. Nobody was ever convicted of killing him. The other 3 inmates were caught 2 days later. The opera. On January 5, 1996, 63-year-old Richard Versal was singing at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. It was opening night of an opera about a woman who had found the secret to living forever. Versal was playing a clerk in the opening scene, singing from the top of a tall ladder. A few minutes in, he sang the line, "You can only live so long." Then he had a heart attack, fell from the ladder, and landed on his back on the stage. He was dead by the time he got to the hospital. The audience thought it was part of the show. The Pig. On October 13, 1131, 15-year-old Prince Philip of France was riding through the streets of Paris with a group of friends. Philip was the son of King Louis VI, and his father had already crowned him king 2 years earlier. They were moving fast along the River Seine. Suddenly, a pig came running out of a pile of waste on the side of the road and ran right between the legs of his horse. The horse was going too fast to avoid it. It tripped and fell forward, and Philip was thrown over its head. He landed on his head, never woke up, and died the next day. His father passed a law banning pigs from the streets of Paris. The Ashes. On the night of March 15, 1731, 62-year-old Countess Cornelia Bandy of Italy wasn't feeling well. She had dinner with her family, then her maid helped her to bed. The two of them talked and prayed together for about 3 hours before the Countess fell asleep. The maid shut the door and left. The Countess had a habit of rubbing brandy all over her body to help with aches and pains. She had done it again that night. There was an oil lamp burning in the room. The next morning, when the Countess didn't wake up at her usual time, the maid went in to check on her. What she found was a pile of ashes on the floor about 4 feet from the bed. 2 legs, still in their stockings, from the knees down, 3 burned fingers, and part of a skull. That was all that was left of the Countess. The bed hadn't burned. The furniture hadn't burned. Nothing else in the room had caught fire. Just her. The stairs. On January 24, 1556, 47-year-old Emperor Humayun was coming down the steep stairs of his library in Delhi with his arms full of books. He heard the call to prayer from a nearby mosque. Humayun always knelt the moment he heard it, no matter where he was, so he tried to drop to his knees right there on the stairs. His foot caught in his robe and he slipped, fell down the steps, and hit his head on a stone edge at the bottom. He died 3 days later. He had only been emperor again for a few months, after spending 15 years fighting to win his empire back. If you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.